So in September of 2012, it had been several years, in fact, 6 years since I had first started working on the documentary. And I felt like, okay, it's time to at least show the ladies that I interviewed that I haven't just been sitting around doing nothing all these years. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. This podcast gives you an exclusive behind-the-scenes look at the documentary Lady Wrestler, the amazing untold story of African-American women in the ring. The documentary chronicles the accomplishments of Black women who broke racial and gender boundaries in the male-dominated field of professional wrestling in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. I'm Chris Bournea, and I'm the director of the documentary. That clip you heard at the beginning of the podcast was about a screening of Lady Wrestler that I organized for the wrestling legends whom I interviewed and their families at the historic Lincoln Theater in the heart of Columbus's African-American community in September 2012, several years before I actually finished the documentary. I'll tell you how that experience ended up later on. But first, in this episode, I'll share more anecdotes and backstage stories from the making of Lady Wrestler. First, for those of you who may not be familiar, here's how the documentary came about. Most of my career has been in print journalism, and in 2005, I was working full-time as a reporter at This Week News, a community newspaper in Columbus, Ohio, which is the birthplace of the golden age of women's wrestling. It's where Billy Wolf, the legendary, some say infamous promoter, set up his women's wrestling enterprise in the 1930s, and where many of the African-American women that he recruited for his wrestling business, including the Wingo sisters, Babs Wingo, Ethel Johnson, and Marva Scott, were living when Billy Wolf recruited them and where they lived and raised their families. So every now and then I would call a public relations specialist in my hometown named Terry Anderson, an African-American man like me, and I would ask him for story ideas. And Terry would often say that, hey, there's this really interesting lady you should interview. I grew up with her in my neighborhood, and she was some kind of wrestler or bodybuilder and always had bodybuilders and wrestlers and prize fighters and all kinds of interesting people hanging out at her house, and you should interview her sometime. So that woman turned out to be Ethel Johnson. Terry set up an interview with Ethel, or Miss Ethel as I called her, out of respect, at a local library toward the end of 2005. So I ended up writing a story about my interview with Miss Ethel that ran in the Columbus Dispatch, the daily newspaper, which owns the community newspaper that I was working for. And I just thought Ethel's story was amazing. She had all these interesting stories about traveling all over the world, going to faraway places like Japan and all through Latin America. She even had a stage or a wrestling name in Latin America, Rita Valdez. She went all through Canada. Montreal was a big wrestling city back in the day. And then, of course, this was in the 50s when she was a teenager. She and her sisters, Babs and Marva, who were also amazing wrestlers, they had to deal with the Jim Crow segregation of the time. They had to go in the back door of restaurants, and they had to stay at segregated hotels. And of course, the major downside of that is being treated like a second-class citizen. But the upside, if there was one, was that there was this camaraderie among athletes and entertainers. So Ethel had these amazing stories of sitting in the lobby of a segregated hotel playing cards with Little Richard. And so what happened is that the Dispatch released the story in the first weekend of March 2006 for Women's History Month. And that weekend just happened to be the weekend when Arnold Schwarzenegger, yes, that Arnold Schwarzenegger, the famous actor and bodybuilder, holds an annual fitness festival in Columbus called the Arnold Classic. And I believe it's called the Arnold Sports Festival now, but it started out being called the Arnold Classic. And from what I know, Arnold Schwarzenegger established this fitness festival in Columbus because he won one of his first major bodybuilding titles in Columbus, Mr. Universe, at an auditorium called Veterans Memorial that has since been torn down and converted into a military museum. So anyway, when Arnold's people saw my article in the Columbus Dispatch, one of his people called me at the newspaper and said that they thought the story about Ethel, that her life was amazing and that they wanted to give her a Lifetime Achievement Award at the closing ceremony of that year's Arnold Festival. So I called Ethel's daughter, Shelley, whom I later found out was the driving force behind getting her mother's story out there. Shelley had been trying for years to get her mother's story documented just so future generations would know about the accomplishments of her mother and her aunts, and it wouldn't just fade into obscurity. So I called Shelley and told her excitedly, that Arnold Schwarzenegger wanted to give her mother a Lifetime Achievement Award. And I could just tell from Shelley's voice that her mother kind of wouldn't be that into it, because by this time, Ethel was a retired grandmother and she really did not like the limelight. In fact, if you see the documentary, there's a whole section with Ethel explaining why she kept her life in the ring a secret and her regular everyday life when she wasn't traveling on wrestling trips. She made sure to keep those lives separate. So Ethel never was one to ring her own bell, even though she was one of the top wrestling stars of her day. But sure enough, Shelley told me, she said, I'll run it by Mom. And then not long after, Shelley called me back and said, Mom said thanks and no thanks. So Ethel turned down a Lifetime Achievement Award from Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I just thought, Ethel's story is so grand. If someone like Arnold Schwarzenegger sees the value in it, then there's obviously something more to it than just one newspaper article. So in my research for the Columbus Dispatch article, I had come across a documentary, a 2004 film called Lipstick and Dynamite, Piss and Vinegar, The First Ladies of Wrestling, by a filmmaker named Ruth Lightman. Now, I am in no way disparaging Ms. Lightman or the documentary, but Lipstick and Dynamite only featured white women. They did not feature any of the Black women like Babs or Ethel or Marva or any of the numerous Black women who were trailblazers in professional wrestling. So I just thought if any women deserve their own movie, it's women like Ethel, these Black women who not only dealt with sexism, but racism as well. So I had always wanted to be a filmmaker. I am not formally trained as a filmmaker. I went to Ohio State University and majored in English. So I have an English degree, but I've always been interested in filmmaking. So I just figured, hey, I'll throw my hat in the ring, no pun intended. And I asked Ethel if she would be willing to be interviewed on camera for a documentary. And to my surprise and to my delight, I guess you could say, she said yes. Interestingly enough, I was able to score another interview with an African-American female wrestling legend through the Dispatch article, but this one was through a total fluke. This interview with wrestling legend Ramona Isbell came about because I had mentioned some of the African-American female peers who wrestled alongside Ethel, and I had misspelled Miss Ramona's name. And Miss Ramona's daughter, Joan, she called me at the newspaper and said, hey, just so you know, you misspelled my mother's name. And I thanked her and said, thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'll ask the paper to, run a correction. And I said, by the way, I'm starting work on this documentary. Do you think your mom might be interested in sitting for an interview? And fortunately, Miss Ramona agreed. So I guess you could say that my error resulted in a stroke of good luck in being able to interview Miss Ramona. Now, an interesting story that happened when I was interviewing Miss Ramona was we did an interview at Memorial Hall in downtown Columbus, or I should say the building, an office building that used to be Memorial Hall. Memorial Hall hosted a lot of wrestling matches back in the 40s and 50s before it was converted into first the Center of Science and Industry, a science museum that's geared toward children that has since relocated to the downtown riverfront in Columbus. And now it is an office building, this building that used to be Memorial Hall. And I don't remember how I ended up reserving a conference room in Memorial Hall to interview Ramona, but it was fitting that we did the interview there because wrestling matches used to be held there. Ramona, by the time I met her, she had retired from the state of Ohio from the Bureau of Workers' Compensation as an administrator there. So she very graciously granted me an interview. So we met up at Memorial Hall, and I was a one-man band. I mean, I did this whole project basically independently with the support of the Wexner Center for the Arts at Ohio State University and a really close friend of mine named Paul Hill that I went to high school with, but more on that later. So while we were doing the interview at Memorial Hall with Ramona, well, I should say I was doing the interview as a one-man band, running camera, running sound. Ramona was like halfway through her life story, and I realized the microphone that I had plugged into the camera was not even turned on. In my haste to set up everything, I had forgotten to turn the microphone on. So I didn't want to interrupt Miss Ramona, so I let her finish her story. And then I very sheepishly said, "Excuse me, Miss Ramona, but your microphone was turned off the whole time. Would you mind if I turned your mic on and you basically repeat your entire life story?" And she was so nice and so gracious. She's such a lovely woman. She did so. She didn't tell me off or tell me I'm incompetent. She just very patiently just saw it as a technical difficulty and repeated her entire life story, which was so sweet of her. Yet another wrestling legend whom I got to interview for the Columbus Dispatch article is a woman named Penny Banner. This is a white lady. She was amazing. Now, when I turned the initial draft of the story about Ethel Johnson into my editors at the Columbus Dispatch, they recommended that I get the perspective of another wrestler who had worked with Ethel to kind of give a sense of what Ethel was like back in the day and what it was like working with her. So I don't know how I came across Penny Banner. I think it may have been through just a Google search. But Penny Banner had just published her autobiography, and she was just very forthcoming, very complimentary of Ethel, and just went on and on about how much she admired Ethel. And so when I started work on the documentary, I thought interviewing Penny Banner would have been a great interview, but unfortunately, Penny passed away before I was able to complete the documentary. But you can see Penny in Lipstick and Dynamite, and I definitely recommend that you go watch Lipstick and Dynamite. I would recommend anyone who is a fan of women's wrestling or is curious about this era, the golden age of women's wrestling, to go watch Lipstick and Dynamite. I totally am a supporter of that documentary. I think Lady Wrestler complements that documentary, and I would say definitely go watch it and learn about Penny Banner and the fabulous Moolah and other women of that era who definitely broke boundaries at that time. Now, after a short break, I'll share a key detail that is missing from the Lady Wrestler documentary, and it might surprise you. What is missing from the Lady Wrestler documentary? In my opinion, as the filmmaker who actually made the documentary, I think the perspective of a Black female cultural commentator is missing from the documentary. And before I started making the documentary, or I guess I should say, while I was in the process of making the documentary, I actually wanted and had planned to interview a female cultural commentator about, just to put into context, the place that these African-American women wrestlers, their place in history. So there was a Martin Luther King event at a nearby college, this college called Wittenberg in Springfield, which is about an hour, I believe, southwest of my hometown of Columbus in Ohio. And a very famous African American cultural commentator came to speak at a Martin Luther King Day celebration. I don't remember what year it was. It may have been like, it was towards the end of the aughts, so it may have been like 2009 or maybe even 2010. I approached this very famous African American, actually male commentator, and I knew his wife was also a very famous commentator. And I went up to her and I told her about these African American wrestling legends, and I asked her if she would be available and interested in appearing in the documentary about the role of Black women in history and how these women in particular had been overlooked. And this woman, this commentator, was very, very enthusiastic. She said, "Oh, yes, please come interview me. You can come to our home and interview me." And we exchanged contact information and we emailed back and forth. And so we set up a date. So I drove all the way from Columbus, Ohio to Washington, D.C., where this commentator lives, because I didn't want to lug all this camera and sound equipment on an airplane. And, having to check luggage and who knows if it would get lost or damaged or whatever in the flight. And I'm just in general an overly cautious driver. I don't go 5 miles over the speed limit. And I hate driving through mountains. Columbus, where I grew up, is very flat, but I don't think that necessarily has anything to do with it, because there's other people that I grew up with in Columbus who are just fine driving through hills and mountains. But one leg of the car trip in particular from Columbus to DC, this mountain that's named after Al Gore's father in Tennessee, that it feels like the first strong wind is going to blow your car over the edge of this really steep mountain. And of course, drivers of semi trucks I have found to be very aggressive drivers. And I had this tiny little Honda Accord at the time, and they would get right on my bumper and then pass me. And the force of them passing me felt like, the just the sheer wind from them passing me was going to blow me over the edge of the mountain. So that was like I had a white knuckle grip on the steering wheel the whole time. So fortunately, I survived that very vexing car trip to Washington, D.C. I drove by myself. I didn't have anyone to even take over the wheel during the 11-hour trip. So when I get to D.C., I try to be professional. I map out the path to the commentator's house the day before. I arrived a day before the interview so that I could have time to get settled and find out where the house is where we were going to do the interview, where the commentator lived, so that I wasn't late for the interview and I didn't waste her time. And so after I got through making this dry run to her house, and come to think of it, maybe she saw me outside her house and had second thoughts and thought, oh, maybe this guy is a stalker or something. But she sent me an email that said she was going to be doing a conference and she had a lot of work to do to prepare for the conference. And could we reschedule the interview? I had driven 11 hours through this treacherous terrain, literally through mountains. I told her, I said I had to take time off work, because I'm still working a day job at this point as a journalist. And, I'll be in and out, in an hour or less. I won't take up much of your time, but I could not convince her to go through with the interview. And she said that she would reschedule, but she ended up ghosting me. She never responded to any of my emails to reschedule the interview. So I just thought of that as I was recording the podcast. Maybe she saw me scoping out her house the day before and thought this guy is some kind of stalker or something, which of course I'm not. I was just simply being professional. I wanted to do a dry run to her house to make sure I could find it so that I wasn't driving around aimlessly around Washington, D.C., where I had never been before. Trying to find her house. So, maybe it was a case of no good deed goes unpunished. But a couple of good things came out of that. Number one, I was able to hang out with a journalist friend of mine that used to work at the newspaper where I worked and had relocated to DC. We were able to hang out and I was able to stay at his place. And the second good thing that came out of that is that I didn't even have to leave Columbus, as it turns out. I was able to do an interview with a Black studies professor named Hassan Jeffries at Ohio State, my alma mater. So I was able to go to campus and do this great interview with Hassan, who was so knowledgeable about all aspects of African American history. He's an author And just as a side note, his brother, Hakeem Jeffries, is in a leadership position in the U.S. House of Representatives. Their family is from New York. And if you listen to the documentary, you can kind of hear Hassan's New York accent a little bit. And even though I had wanted a Black female commentator, Hassan just knocked it out of the park with his commentary. So I'm so grateful for Hassan. And another little story that I have to share about doing the interview with Hassan. I don't know what it was with me and car trips making this documentary, but on the way to interview Hassan, I had taken the afternoon off from my day job, and I got a flat tire on the way to interview Hassan. And I don't remember exactly, I think I drove on the flat tire to Ohio State. Because I was running late, I had left my day job in just enough time to make it to Ohio State's campus in time for the interview. So I think what I did was I think I drove on the flat tire to Ohio State and then called AAA after the interview with Hassan. But that was just lucky that I didn't cause a wreck or something driving on a flat tire. But it's just weird that I had kind of two kind of bad experiences with car trips going to do interviews with cultural commentators for the wrestling documentary. But it all turned out okay because Hassan was amazing and his commentary was awesome. Another trip to DC that I ended up doing for the documentary was in 2011. So this was probably a year or two after that ill-fated trip with the female cultural commentator. I had read Jeff Lean's book, Queen of the Ring, about Mildred Burke, who was the wife of promoter Billy Wolf and the first women's world wrestling champion. And Jeff is so knowledgeable about the history of wrestling. And Jeff is the one who actually referred me to the University of Notre Dame, which has a huge wrestling archive, and where I got a lot of the archival photos and footage that you'll see in Lady Wrestler. So going to interview Jeff, who is a full-time reporter at the Washington Post. First of all, I have to give a shout out to my good friend, Will Haygood, who is also a reporter at the Washington Post and a very accomplished author who wrote the article that the movie The Butler with Oprah Winfrey and Forrest Whitaker is based on. So Will had come back home to Columbus, which he periodically does for a book signing. And I told him about the documentary with the women wrestlers. And Will told me, he said, if you're really serious about finding out about the history of women's wrestling, you need to interview my colleague at the Washington Post, Jeff Lean. And so Jeff told me that he could not do the interview in the Washington Post office because the Washington Post had this policy about not having the paper seem like it was endorsing, someone's project, someone's, movie project, documentary project or whatever. So Jeff told me that we needed to find another location other than his office at the Washington Post to do the interview. So I rented a hotel conference room at a local DC hotel near the Washington Post. And just by chance, the room I rented ended up being next to the kitchen. So luckily you can't hear it in the documentary. But while I was interviewing Jeff Lean, there were forks and knives and spoons and plates being clanked around in the kitchen, by the hotel staff. And luckily, my friend Paul Hill, the editor at the Wexner Center, where I did the post-production, where I was able to get a fellowship, they gave me free post-production. It's such a great resource and a little-known resource at Ohio State, the Wexner Center for the Arts, in their film video studio program that gives fellowships to filmmakers to do post-production. Anyway, Paul was able to remove the clanking and the clacking of the dishes and the silverware from the interview with Jeff Lean, thankfully. And another little mishap that happened with sound in Lady Wrestler that luckily Paul at the Wexner Center was able to clean up was the interview with the Detroit wrestling fan, Kenny Clark. I interviewed him at his home in suburban Detroit. And of course, just as the camera started rolling, Kenny's next door neighbor started mowing his lawn. So in the raw footage with the interview with Kenny Clark, you can hear his neighbor mowing his lawn. But once again, thanks to the expert studio wizardry by my friend Paul was able to clean up the sound so you don't hear the lawnmower in the background in my interview with Kenny Clark. So big shout out to my friend Paul. I could not have done it without him and everyone at the Wexner Center for the Arts. So another little interesting story, a mishap that happened during the filming of Lady Wrestler was The main interview with Ethel Johnson and her daughters took place at a local organization that I will not name because I don't want to embarrass anyone at the organization, because the organization was very generous with me in letting me use one of their conference rooms. But when I spoke to a representative at the organization and told them I wanted to book a conference room, this representative told me that they would give me a discount considering the historical subject matter in the rate for renting the room. And the representative told me, "Oh, we'll give it to you for $75." And I thought, oh my God, what a discount. They'll let me film in this conference room for an entire day for $75. I cannot beat that. So after we did this interview, it was a full, almost an entire Saturday with Ethel and her daughters and her niece, Kim Martin, who is a great friend of mine and who also commented on her mother, Marva, and Marva's struggles in the wrestling industry. We spent this entire day at this organization in their conference room. And then I don't know how much later it was, maybe a few days or maybe even a few weeks later, I get a bill from the organization. And it turns out it wasn't $75 for the whole day. It was $75 an hour. So I almost choked when I saw this big bill for, I forget how, I mean, it was probably only a few $100s or several $100s once everything was totaled up. But I was prepared to pay only $75. So that's just a lesson that when things seem too good to be true, a lot of times they are. And that's a lesson for anyone, filmmakers or anyone trying to do anything, that to get everything in writing so that things are spelled out and you're not surprised with any hidden fees or hit with any bills at the last minute that are going to really surprise you. Circling back to the story about the screening at the Lincoln Theater. So in September of 2012, it had been several years, in fact, 6 years since I had first started working on the documentary. And I felt like, okay, it's time to at least show the ladies that I interviewed that I haven't just been sitting around doing nothing all these years. It's time to put together a what they call a rough cut, which is like sort of an unfinished version of the final film, and show them what I've been working on so I can kind of get their feedback. So I rented the Lincoln Theater, this beautiful historic theater in the heart of the African-American community in Columbus. And so it turns out my editor and my friend Paul Hill and I were working until the last minute, literally the last minute before the documentary, doing finishing touches on this rough cut of the documentary so that we could show it to the wrestling ladies and their families. And I mean, we finished by the skin of our teeth. And Paul burned a DVD for me to give to the projectionist at the Lincoln Theater. And I mean, it was literally like we almost didn't make it because I had to be at the theater early to meet with the representative who was going to let me in and, show me around the facility. And I mean, this is a screening that almost didn't happen. Just working late into the day, this was a Saturday, with my editor to try to get the documentary in a usable form that we could actually show it to people. And of course, I wanted to make the best impression possible on these women because this is their life story that they entrusted me with. And so it was just by the grace of God that we finished and burned it to a DVD so that we could show it to the women and their families. And I have to say, the women and their families were just so supportive. It was just so great to get their applause, not for me, but the families were, of course, applauding, their mom and their aunts, and seeing their story on a big screen in this historic theater was emotional for everyone. So I'm so glad that even though it was like a race to the finish and I almost didn't make it, that we were able to have this successful screening while the women were alive and well to enjoy it. And that was really the kind of the best experience of making this documentary, was getting to show it to the women and to experience their gratitude. That just humbled me so much, and I will cherish that for the rest of my life, for sure. next edition of Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. Why Columbus? How did a mid-sized Midwestern city that's known as the biggest small town in America become the birthplace of the golden age of women's wrestling? You'll learn some interesting facts about Ohio's capital city from one of its native sons, me. That's next time on Lady Wrestler, the story behind the story. Please rate and review us on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Because when you leave a rating and review on whatever platform that you access this podcast, that enables more people to discover us and more people to find out about these amazing women and the contributions they made to history. And be sure to catch the documentary on Amazon Prime Video. Thank you for listening. Catch you next time.